Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to First Person, the show where we meet the most interesting people in IT and learn from them what makes them tick by focusing only on their firsts. I'm your host, Matt Egan, asking you to enjoy, like, and subscribe wherever you find us. And if you're an interesting person in IT, let us know. You might be the next first person. The next voice you hear will be today's guest. He is Aaron Momin. Aaron describes himself as a seasoned cybersecurity and cyber risk professional, and he has more than 30 years of experience in managing cyber and technology risk. Therefore, Aaron is definitely one of the most interesting people in IT, and we're delighted to have him as a guest on First Person. So, Aaron, welcome. And first up, what's the first thing people should know about you?
Well, first of all, yeah, thank you so much for having me on this show. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited about this conversation. I would say, I think, my traits are that I am very empathetic and I treat
Mhm.
others with a lot of respect. And I've noticed that in my career, when you treat people with respect, you get that back in return. So I think, just understanding where people are coming from. Everybody has different perspectives in
Mhm.
terms of how to think about things. And, I've learned that we have to appreciate whether you agree with them or not, that
Yeah,
you have to appreciate where they're coming from. And I think,
yeah,
I've done that really well, and to me, it just comes naturally. But I think that a lot of times when we're so immersed in execution, we might tend to forget that, right,
yeah,
and lose focus. But I think in my opinion, I do that really well. The other thing I'll say is that I'm very energetic. I'm a high performer. I love to work on multiple different threads at the same time, and in that, I really appreciate working with different types of people with different personalities, and I think that goes a long way.
yeah. Amazing. Lots to unpick there, actually, Aaron. Thank you for giving us that open answer to that question. I mean, I think we speak to a lot of leaders, very successful people, and that empathy is a superpower, right? Understanding that not everybody is coming from the same angle, and being able to shape your approach with colleagues, with peers, with people who work for you, to help them achieve their best is like a real kind of superpower, and something that I think is sometimes missed with high performance people, right, who just presume that everybody else wants to operate in the same way. Or actually that we all operate that way every day because we don't, right? We're human beings, we have our ups and downs. But I'm really excited, even more excited to have this conversation now because that sets us up really nicely to go into our first section, which we call First Things First. This is where, Aaron, we want to get to know about you by understanding some of your first times. So please, could you tell us about your first job in this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I started on this journey about 30 years ago, and I was always interested in IT and security. And my first role was really around doing a lot of network security troubleshooting and
Mhm.
configuration and deployment. And so, that was my first sort of foray. Coming out of school. At that time, it was a company called Coopers and Lybrand, which hadn't officially merged with Price Waterhouse, which is now
Mhm.
today known as PwC,
POC.
but
Yep.
before, it was the legacy organization. And, just being part of that group, getting different exposures, really getting technical hands-on experience. I think that was my first introduction to working in IT and IT security. That was pretty exciting.
So you, first of all, you came out of school. What were you studying in college, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, absolutely. It was computer information systems,
Okay.
right? It's not to completely geek out, but that's I've always been interested in IT and security, and I certainly went to school for that.
Yeah.
I had a thesis around computer information systems and how to set up different labs and so on. So it was really exciting to work
Yeah.
at Cooper's, and just having that hands-on
Yeah.
troubleshooting and configuration and kind of setup type experience was really exciting to really get me immersed into the industry and how we
Yeah.
work with IT.
But it takes a certain sort of person, right? And like, I think about my own career as a journalist. Like my early career was spent as a production sub editor, so you really got deep into every part of the process, kind of thing. And I think that's like a really useful grounding. But also, I'm interested, Aaron, because I suspect we're of a similar age, and I went to college having never used a computer, right? It was feasible to do that, and actually, my roommate in my first year, who's a very good friend of mine, He was a computer science student, but it was possible. So it was possible for both things to be true, kind of thing. Like to have literally never. I once pulled his computer cable out of the wall when he asked me to switch his computer off because I just didn't
Oh,
know, kind of
sure.
thing. Um, um,
Yeah.
and I'm interested in, by the time you got to college, right, computer science was the thing for you. Like, what started that fire burning? Like, what was it that made you want to go in that direction? Do you think?
Yeah, I'd love to, like my first computer was a Compaq. It was an X386 computer. I really enjoyed, taking it apart, putting that
Right.
together, just looking at different parts, then your network interface card, your hard drives and kind of daisy chaining them. And, I was, when I first gotten that computer, I was playing around with it and it just really intrigued me and got me really interested. And so, that was it. Once I got my hands dirty, I wanted more. So
Interesting. How cool as well, right? That it was that kind
yes.
of instant thing. And then I guess having that role at Cooper's right in the early days, again, I'd like to pick at this a little bit, but being able to go technical really early on and learn the thing, learn the industry, learn the craft in that level of detail. Was that the point at which you were kind of like, yeah, this is for me. This is the industry I'm gonna work in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love being hands-on. Obviously through my career progression, I'm less technical now because I manage teams to help me deliver. But earlier on in the career, it was just having the experience of touching different things, deploying different things.
Yeah.
I've also done a bunch of physical pen testing work as well, and I think I really enjoyed that aspect of the profession as how can we break things? How can I figure out vulnerabilities? How don't and just to get that kind of sense,
Yeah.
it got me really excited, kind of thinking out of the box, right? And understanding that side of the world. So that was really interesting to me.
So I'm interested in this progression as well, right? Because again, I think there are multiple paths open to everybody. But you do tend to find that with people who are really getting their hands dirty and understand the thing in detail, there's two paths, right? There is the becoming the expert at doing the thing, and then there's the leadership path, right? And they're not always kind of compatible, but you have moved on to some pretty significant senior leadership roles. I'm interested in how kind of that transition went, and at what point you thought, you know, I want not just to be doing, I want to be leading.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think it comes with experience. It comes
Mhm.
with working with different people and managing different people. And there's also the soccer and business side of the skills you have to kind of learn, right? So I grew up being very technical, but as I progressed in my career, it's just really understanding the people aspect of the business.
Right.
And I also find that very interesting is being able to mentor
Yeah.
other folks. And I've mentored a significant number of people in my career, and I found that I can be a good leader, and that I actually enjoy translating technical concepts to the business,
Yeah.
to our senior leaders, to our board of directors, and so on. Is I get excited about talking about here are the vulnerable exposures and what does that mean to our business, right? And so being able to
Yeah.
do that, it takes a certain kind
It does.
of skill and takes certain kind of experience to be able to do that. And I,
Yeah.
I think I found myself, having that, kind of tactical ability to be able to do that. So at some point, kind of midway through my career, I decided to focus more on the people aspect of things and
Yeah.
kind of really being hungry to take on more and more, mentees, if you will, and just really kind of guiding people through their journeys.
Yeah. I mean, that speaks to the empathy answer you gave, like, right at the top, you have to enjoy other people to be in that leadership role, and I love what you talked about there about being able to translate, because that is the key to so much success. The IT strategy should be the business strategy, right? But technical people have to be able to explain in a clear but non-patronizing way what it means, um, for the business. Um, I'm interested in, you've spoken a lot, and I really believe that you buy into that mentor thing, and you've been a great mentor. But I presume at some stage along the line here, you've been helped yourself by by bosses, by mentors. I wonder if you could speak something about like the first great boss you recall and what they did for you or with you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, very early on in my career, working, through PwC, one of my mentors, told me to pay attention to detail.
Mhm.
Right? At that time, I just wanted to kind of play with different tools and products, and I wasn't really that detail oriented in terms of documenting things, right? So I was told, hey, when you summarize things and when you want to present something or when you want to kind of get your story across, pay attention to details. Like everything matters in how you kind of message something, how you explain something. And it took me a lot of time to understand how that works, to tell my
Mhm.
story correctly. Because before it was just kind of scatter thoughts coming across across the board. But my first boss essentially really helped me kind of get my act together, being able to document things
Yeah,
correctly, paying attention to very details and how you word things, how you articulate things down to the font sizes,
yeah,
how you
yeah,
present things, right? Presentation is everything, right? You could have a good story, but if you don't present it in a good way, whether it's visually or even if it's written, you may not get across the
yeah,
message the way you wanted to. So I think that really, gave me good guiding lessons to just kind of engage with people in a good way.
yeah. Well, and I think that's true of, it must be true of every profession, right? That there are many people who are talented, but it's that talent applied to the discipline, the attention to detail, the effort, frankly. Because you said it, like it's cool if you can do it, but if you can't do it in a way that is documented and communicated to other people, it sort of doesn't matter, kind of thing. Um, and then so all of these things come together. You've clearly a super smart guy. You've built connections with people because that's something that inspires you. You're a high achiever. You're driving hard. You've got the technical expertise. Was there a change? Was there a job change or even like a role change that kind of really set you up for where you are? Is there a first kind of promotion that you can think of that kind of set you on the path?
Yeah, I think again going back to early in my career, had started out internally within Coopers, and as we kind of merged into PwC, I started to do more client facing roles,
Right.
from a consulting and a delivery perspective. And I really enjoyed that. So I was, there's a period of time where I was kind of dabbling on both as doing a lot of internal work and investigative work, deployment work. But then I started to do more consulting like engagements, obviously working for a consulting provider like PwC. And so, that's when I made the official switch is, hey, I really like to be client facing because as I
Yeah.
mentioned before, right, I enjoy working with people. I like to learn everybody's story. I find myself good in front of our clients, and so I officially kind of pivoted towards being very consulting
Mhm.
driven, and that exposed me to all these new opportunities and also a lot of travel. I enjoy traveling, traveling across the globe. My first largest project was actually in Finland,
Wow.
Helsinki, and they had called me on a Friday saying, "Hey, can you be in Helsinki, over the weekend? We need you there Monday."
Wow.
And so, I find that really cool. At that time I was young and hungry and ready to learn. So I think that was a kind of pivotal switch to being, and it's a different world. Consulting is a different world.
Yeah.
And that was, I think that really changed my whole career trajectory.
How cool. I'm interested. I have to ask, what time of year was it when you got sent to Finland over a weekend?
Yeah, no, it was over the summer.
Oh,
It
that's
wasn't
good.
winter
Yeah,
yet.
because
And so
because
fortunately, yeah.
yeah, it would have been a very different experience if it was in the depth of winter. But it's interesting how these things play together because that's I think the client facing thing is another really key part of career development. If you want your career to take in a senior leadership role, like you've got to have the technical chops, you've got to understand the strategy, you have to really run towards and embrace working with different people and helping them to succeed and supporting and leading. But you also have to understand what the product is and who the customer is at the end of the day. And very few super successful people don't have that in their kind of in their locker. So this is super interesting, Aaron, and I'm really enjoying hearing about your successes. But on this show, we don't allow our guests just to talk about the good things. We find it more interesting to dive into the bad stuff, right? So section two is where we talk about first fails, because we believe we learn more from our mistakes. And so I would really like to hear, if you don't mind, Aaron, about what you would consider to be your first big mistake professionally.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that kind of looking back in retrospect, right? Just making sure that, especially as being an IT or security professional,
Mhm.
that, we don't work in a vacuum,
Yeah,
and I think it's too often that, technologists tend to work in that capacity as, hey,
yeah,
I've been assigned to do X, Y, Z. Let me go and do that,
yeah,
from a technical perspective, and it's really important to have good collaboration. It's important to have, set your expectations with the stakeholders and other folks that you're working with, and not kind of operate in that vacuum. So I've had instances where, I've done that and I've
yeah,
learned the hard way that, that's not always the best strategy is,
yeah,
because there's a lot of there could be a lot of misunderstandings, expectations not set correctly. And so I kind of figured that out the hard way, but I figured out also quickly in terms of, hey, just collaborate with other people, make sure the expectations are set correctly, and then kind of
yeah,
you're moving towards a common goal, right? So I'm
yeah,
kind of generalizing it, but I think,
yeah,
I learned that, and then I apply that today in practice is, making sure I'm not just kind of off on my own,
yeah,
doing things kind of solo, but it's really important to kind of team together, have that partnership, making sure that you're also pulling from other talent,
yeah,
getting different perspectives to help you succeed,
yeah.
right? And I think, by having those partnerships, by helping building those bridges, I think that's the key to success is not just kind of going at all.
Yeah, no, I completely and actually used the word there that I thought I was thinking all the way through. You said perspective. I was thinking perspective and context, right? And I think this is not unique to IT, although it can be a really critical thing within IT. But like, if you at any level are doing the thing because we've been told to do the thing, ticking the box, hitting that KPI, but that activity isn't aligned with the broader mission. And I mean mission very specifically rather than strategy or tactic of the organization. Like we're not succeeding, right? And we've all experienced in our lives the person from the other department in the organization who wants things to work a certain way, and but that it isn't going to support your piece. And I think IT is so much the skeleton and the lifeblood of organizations. It's so critically important that before we put a spade in the ground, we understand if this really is where we want to dig, kind of thing. And that
Absolutely.
that that
Absolutely.
empathy and that communication, that ability to kind of translate to the business operative what's happening here and get to a good consensus around how we move forward is a really positive thing. But it's a mistake I suspect every successful person's made, right? They
Agreed.
they
Agreed.
plowed ahead with what we knew to be the right thing, but it may not have been the right thing for everybody at that time, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think the key thing there, to your point, also is expectations, right? I think it sounds straightforward, it sounds like a given thing, but just making sure that everybody's aligned with what's
Yeah.
expected. What's the goal of what you're trying to achieve,
Yes.
and then also along the way, it's not just once and done kind of
Yeah.
discussion, right? It's kind of along the way. Are we going around the right? Are we going in the right path? Are we doing
Yeah.
the right things? Is this what you
Yeah.
expect to see? Like, are we achieving the results? Like, because having that dialogue is monumental, I think,
Yeah.
to
No, I completely agree. That's why, I very deliberately chose the word mission, right? Because, strategies change, tactics should change all the time as we course correct, but we should have a mission which will change, but, like, not very often because it's where we're headed, and making sure everything aligns together is something that I think successful leaders are good at, but it is a lesson we all have to learn. And I think along similar terms, one of the questions I love asking because we get very varied answers, including like this hasn't happened yet, but was there a first time that you realized something you thought you knew might actually be wrong?
Yeah, no, again, this comes back to expectations. One of the projects that I was working on was to, not to get too technical, but to deploy a kind of load balanced firewall into an environment. And from the outset, the expectations weren't set correctly because what that project was intended to do, wasn't going to produce the right outcomes. But we didn't know that initially, and I kind of went down that path of deploying this load balance firewall. And in those days, and we're talking in the late '90s, early 2000s, um, you know, that was new technology. And
Mhm.
so, I was set out to do this work. And by the way, that work was predominantly taking place in a data center. So I was sitting inside a data center,
Yeah.
for like days and weeks in a row, just kind of deploying this stuff. And it's not, for those that have worked in cold data centers, it's not the most enjoyable or memorable experience. But anyway, so coming back to the question, as I'm going along this project, I realized that, just the way the applications work in the background, this load balance firewall wasn't the right solution because it was new technology and because of the way the application worked
Yeah.
in the back end, it wasn't the right solution. So as I was going down that path, I quickly realized that this is not going to work out well. So it's kind of like, putting this kind of square peg in a round hole, so to speak, right? So I had to kind of backtrack, work with our, management and our stakeholders to talk about, what some alternatives could be. It took a lot of level setting. There were some hard conversations to be had.
Yeah.
Why are we where we are? But that's when I kind of realized that something was wrong, and it requires a good amount of transparency. I think the lessons learned from that story is, transparency is huge, right? Let's be transparent of what went wrong to begin with. What are we doing to course correct, and what do we make sure that doesn't happen again, right?
Yeah.
So, that kind of experience was definitely a learning experience for me.
Yeah, for sure. And such a key learning, right? I mean, an old boss of mine always used to say, the hard conversation is the conversation you have to have, like, soonest, right? The one you're worried about having. And I can imagine in that scenario, like the dawning realization that the solution we're pursuing is not the right solution. Nobody is gonna be happy when you say that, but you have to say it, and the sooner you say it, the better for everybody kind of thing. So a key learning. Okay, amazing. Thank you, Aaron. No, this is a wonderful conversation. I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah.
We would like to move on to our next section now, which we call quick fire firsts, because we really want to get to know you beyond your professional veneer. And we wanna find out about the real person, and the way we do that is we outsource to a little bit of patented technology we've got, which is our random question generator. So, Aaron, if you would, could you please pick a number between 1 and, let's say, 14?
How about 8?
8. Number 8. Okay. You talked about travel, and we heard about your Finland adventures. This question is the first place you would go if time and money were no object.
Oh, I would say without a doubt, it would be Iceland.
Ah,
I
great.
just really, I've been there a number of times. It is an amazing, incredible place, especially if you're into outdoors, like exploring.
Yeah,
It's just a phenomenal place with the picturesque
yeah.
landscapes and a lot of different experiences. So I would say hands down, it would be Iceland
That's
for
cool.
sure.
And looks like you couldn't be anywhere else on the earth, right, when you're out in Iceland, which is cool. So
Absolutely.
tell me about that. You talk about, liking to be outdoors. Is that, are you out there sort of hiking around? Is it the wildlife, the combination of all of the above?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all the above, right? And in particular, I mean, in that story about Iceland, just kind of seeing some of the dormant volcanoes,
Yeah,
seeing the natural, terrain, and kind of having that experience is just
yeah,
it's just phenomenal.
yeah.
It's a truly unique place in the world.
It is. It is. That's a very cool answer, and also not one we've had before. Although I'm not sure it'd be top of my list. But I definitely share, that viewpoint. We should go together. It'd be great.
Yes,
Let's,
absolutely.
let's try for another one then. Another, number between, 1 and 14, please, Aaron.
Yeah. How about 5?
Number 5. Could you tell me anything about your the first childhood friends that you remember?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I actually grew up in India, and I was born and raised in India, and
Uh-huh.
we immigrated to the United States. In sort of the mid '80s. But absolutely, I remember living in
Wow.
Mumbai, which is one of the largest cities in
Yeah, yes.
India. And I have some good fun memories of a couple of friends that we grew up with, and we learned how to ride a bicycle and things like
Yeah,
that. So that's been kind of nostalgic. Always stick out in my mind is it having that experience. But we've stayed in touch, and
yeah,
so we
that's
kind of
amazing.
just yeah, just seeing where we've gone in our professional life, and
Yeah,
also in our personal lives. I've stayed in touch with these friends, and actually, I was out in India not too long ago, and actually visited him, and just to kind of know what he's up to, and getting to know his family more in detail, and so
mm,
just being in touch with who
yeah,
and building that network, is my point, is phenomenal. It could start at a very basic intimate level with your friends or your family members and people you meet, to people you meet in your profession, but just building that network
yeah,
of those kinds of people is paramount, because you never know whom you'll run across where and when.
yeah,
But just having that network, is critical to your personal development, and also
definitely.
obviously from a professional perspective as well.
Definitely. I mean, life is other people, right? And, like I always think you're never unhappy when someone gets in touch, right? Like, it's always a net positive, and that's we're a species that likes to run in packs, and it's really important to make those connections. But I will also say there's a reason why we ask these questions, Aaron, and you know, like you just drop in there that you grew up in India and then moved from India to the
Yeah,
United States in the mid '80s, which I'm imagining was a fairly decent culture shock.
it was. It certainly was. It certainly was. But I think it's being adaptive. All
Yeah,
right, and those people. I love immersing myself in different cultures. I'm very globally traveled. And and then that's the thing about me is, no matter where I am, I adjust and I adapt. And for me, the migration to the U.S., was, I wouldn't say a difficult or challenging thing. It was very intriguing,
yeah,
and certainly evolved, quite a bit, with the move. So
yeah. Well,
it was a good thing.
they say, uh, all data shows that children who are brought up with 2 languages in their household tend to
Yes.
have better outcomes, and there's 2 theories to it, right? One is because, in any case, if you've been taught 2 languages, you definitely have the support to learn, like, 1 language, so you're probably doing better than, the family where that support isn't there. But another more intriguing theory, which I tend to subscribe to, is you've immediately got 2 different concepts. The French word for kitchen is cuisine, but cuisine means something very different to kitchen in the way that an English or American person would say it. And that immediately just broadens your mind to the fact that there's a whole different set of concepts. So I have to presume, like being in Mumbai, and by the way, learning to ride a bike in Mumbai, I mean, like I've tried to cross the road in Mumbai. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, if you can ride or even drive your car in India, I mean, I think you could drive
You can
anywhere in
drive
the
anywhere.
world, quite
Yeah,
frankly.
right.
Yeah, it's
But
extremely stressful.
But having that view of the world and the US view of the world immediately is kind of, to someone who's open-minded as you clearly are, that's kind of a superpower as well, really, in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. My father's family moved from Ireland to the UK, in the '50s, and he still remembers the first time he saw an elevator. It absolutely blew his mind because
Wow.
he'd never seen anything like that. So yeah.
That's amazing.
So amazing, and I'm so glad we asked that question because you never know what you're going to get when you ask these silly questions. Let's move into section 4, which is the final section of the show. Sadly, Aaron, we call this first and final thoughts. And I'm excited to ask you. What's the first piece of advice you would give to someone who's just starting out?
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to get into cyber. It's such an intriguing and interesting field. And I get that question a lot of times from
Mhm.
a lot of, folks and friends, in my network. And I would say, definitely know your basics, from a technology perspective,
Yeah,
right? It's really, if you want to get into cybersecurity, you have to understand how the internet works, how TCP/IP works, and, what is the interconnectedness like. So it's really important to, know your basics in terms of, what is a PC, what are the different components of it, how does networking work, and understanding those basic foundational aspects is, I think it's critical. Not everybody tends to be technical, and
Yeah.
you may not need to be technical within cyber, but having said that, it's in my opinion, it's still good to start off in that, kind of learnings,
Yes.
and then you can kind of go beyond that. And
Yeah.
if you don't wish to stay technical, I think that's fine too. But I think it's really important to understand those
Yeah.
basics. So I think that's there. The second part I would say is, do not discount learning the softer side of things, right? Your softer skills or business skills, because oftentimes, a lot of folks getting into the field are so excited about learning
Yeah.
things about security, they tend to forget about the business side of the world. And,
Yeah.
I think it's really important to kind of balance out the trainings and learnings with understanding, how to speak the language of the business.
Yeah.
How do we communicate to other stakeholders or to your executives, and kind of learning the softer skills as well. So I would just say that definitely don't discount, the softer side of the, skills that you need to develop. But I think having a good balance, I think, would be key.
I think that's excellent advice, frankly, in any industry. Again, like I think back, when I first started out working for the organization I work for now, I was the print production editor of a magazine about desktop computers, right? None of those things exist anymore.
Yeah,
But the basics, the mechanics of understanding how the whole business works from top to bottom, like means that you're then able to speak. You have to understand things change, and yet none of those skills that I had are required anymore. But the fundamental understandings of how things work, they don't change, and they're super important. But also, to
absolutely.
your point, you can be like we talked about this before, right? You can be the most technical expert on a thing, and actually that is fine. It's limiting, but it's fine. Like, there are lead developers at
Definitely.
organizations who are the only people in the world who fully understand how to make something work, and that's incredibly valuable. But if you want to lead and if you want to influence strategy, you need to be able to translate them. I talked about my roommate at college, like, he's had a very successful career because he will tell you himself he was never the best developer, but he understood how to speak to the business about what they were developing
Exactly.
and create
Exactly.
solutions rather than
And
rather than
it's a partnership, right?
yeah,
It's, coming back to what we said earlier, is, having that bridge, having the collaboration and partnership, being able to speak the language of the business. It's, we're all humans, right? And I
yeah,
think it's, it's, we need to have that ability to communicate, get on the same page, set those expectations. So I think it's critical to be able to collaborate, and as I said before, not work in a vacuum, right? And so just being able to, communicate and get your message
yeah,
across is critical.
yeah. No, I completely agree. I completely agree. Aaron, I'm sad to say this. We're reaching the end of our time together, and I feel like we could talk for hours. Maybe we should do it again sometime, but our only non
Likewise.
yeah, our only
Absolutely.
non-first question is quite an open question, but I'm interested to ask you this. Would you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this might apply to, any industry really, but for cyber in particular, I think it's critical that, everybody stays hyper connected to what's happening out there, right? The pace of how cybersecurity moves is at light speed, right?
Mhm.
What happens, today will be history. It's about tomorrow. So it's really important for cybersecurity professionals to be, super connected to what's happening in the threat landscape, to understand new emerging technologies, to understand different perspectives, to understand what our other stakeholders are working on, whether it's within privacy or whether it's within legal or whether it's within the business. So be hyper connected, find ways. There's definitely tools out there that you can use to stay connected, to be informed, whether it's RSS feeds or social media or what have you. I think it's super critical. Definitely carve out, some time in the day to
Yeah,
read up on things, right? To be connected, expand your network, as I mentioned before. Networking is paramount, right? So keep building your network just on a daily basis, right? It doesn't have to be professional. It could even be in your personal life,
yeah,
right? Just go out there. You could be in a grocery store, shopping for food, and you might bump into somebody, but that bumping into somebody could turn into something,
yeah,
in the future that, you haven't planned on. So I think, my final thoughts there are just to be super connected, keep thinking about networking, and stay abreast of what's happening in the
yeah,
industry by all means.
yeah. It's really great advice. I mean, it's about, in essence, it's take yourself and take the craft and the work seriously, but also, and I absolutely love that point about the network and where you meet people. It's amazing. I could speak to myriad times of like doing activities outside of professional life, being a school governor, being a soccer coach, where like you connect with people, and then who knows where that goes, kind of thing. And I'll find myself later on reflecting of the impact on my professional life, even if the connection itself isn't specifically related to work. I've picked up something, I've developed something.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's life is pretty sweet when you take that approach, I think.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My thanks to Aaron Momin, and thank you for watching and listening to this show, First Person, the show where we meet the most interesting people in IT and learn from them what makes them tick, focusing only on their first. I think you'll agree that was a great conversation. I have been your
Absolutely. Well,
host,
thank
Matt
you so
Egan.
much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron, and yeah, I've enjoyed it so much. I've been your host, Matt Egan, and I ask all of you viewers and listeners to enjoy, like, and subscribe wherever you find us. And if you're an interesting person in IT, do let us know because you could be the next first person. But obviously, I have to finish by giving my sincere thanks to Aaron Momin. Thank you so much, and goodbye.